This event is another cooperation with the Thomas Mann House in Los Angeles, which was a former residence of the famous German author, and I think since 2018 now is a residency for fellows. Two of our guests tonight, Nikita Dhawan and Maria do Mar Castro Varela, are actual residents at Thomas Mann House, and we're happy that you made your way from the West Coast to the East Coast. I think with a stop in between in Chicago, so that's not that far, but far enough, and thanks that you made your way. On September 22nd last year, so nearly exactly 1 year ago, we hosted a panel here with 3 curators, artists, and scholars from Boston to reflect about Documenta 15, which took place just a few weeks before. This Documenta, maybe besides the Biennale in Venice, most of the important arts exhibitions worldwide, as you know. One of the topics we were strongly discussing was the question where the boundaries are between activism and art, and how political art should be. So if you're interested in this discussion, you can look it up on our YouTube channel, because we recorded that as well. I think that could be an interesting starting point for the discussion today, because these questions seem to be relevant to Nikita and Maria as well when you look at their project description, what they want to work on while they are at the Thomas Mann House in LA. They ask, for example, what role can or should art play in the face of increasing social injustices, or can critical artistic practices facilitate transnational justice and democracy and protect and promote human rights? Our third guest, Boston-based artist, scholar, and activist Tania Bruguera, tonight live from Brazil or Chile, or hi Tania, Chile. Wonderful that you are here. Was taking part at this mentioned Documenta last year and curated multiple shows of and with Cuban artists, aiming to give justice to artists and intellectuals censored by the Cuban government. She is deeply involved in these topics as well. And Andrea Patiño Contreras, a Colombian video journalist and editor currently based in Boston as well, opens the box towards the fields of documentary and journalism while asking how this area is influenced by the legacy of colonialism and how marginalized groups could and should be represented appropriately. But before starting the discussion, let me quickly introduce our guests a little bit more. Don't be afraid, that's not too long. The incredible, astonishing, great CVs you can look up on the website of the Goethe-Institut and on the website of our panelists. But let me say a few words. The installation and performance artist Tania Bruguera works as a senior lecturer in media and performance for the Department of Art, Film and Visual Studies at Harvard. So she's partly, I guess, Boston-based as well. She researches ways in which art can be applied for everyday political life, focusing on the transformation of social affect into political effectiveness. Her work has been exhibited at prestigious institutions and exhibitions like the mentioned Documenta twice, the Guggenheim Museum, Tate Modern, and the Biennales of Guangzhou, Istanbul, or Shanghai, just to mention a few of them. Andrea Patiño Contreras, video journalist, as I said, and editor, currently is based in Boston. She's interested in all aspects of filmmaking, from the early stages of research to the most intricate details of post-production. Most of her work revolves around questions of migration and mobility and the Latino community in the US and across Latin America. She also has extensive experience covering gender and sexual violence topics. Nikita Dhawan holds a chair for political theory and history of ideas at the Technical University Dresden. Her research and teaching focuses on global justice, human rights, democracy, and decolonization. She has held visiting fellowships at numerous universities like Costa Rica, Australia, Spain, South Korea, and in the US, in Berkeley and Columbia, for example. And Maria do Mar Castro Varela is professor of pedagogy and social work at the Elis Salomon University in Berlin. Her research interests besides post-colonial theory lie in gender and queer studies, social justice, digital hate, and emancipation. She lectured, amongst others, in Basel, Zurich, Vienna, Busan, and Costa Rica. Nikita and Maria are actual, as I said, Thomas Mann Fellows in Los Angeles.
So, as Jörg pointed out, Maria and I are current fellows at the Thomas Mann House. And just to give you a bit of a context, Thomas Mann was a Nobel Prize-winning German writer who had to flee Nazi Germany and was based in LA and then had to leave the US during the McCarthy era because of accusations of communism. And ultimately, the family moved back to Europe, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, he passed away in Switzerland. And the Thomas Mann House, every year since the house has been converted into, since the fellowship program was kick-started in 2018, has a topic that it announces, and this year's topic was Mandate of the Arts. So Maria and I applied with a project proposal in response to this call. And one of the ideas of this residency program is also to promote transatlantic dialogue between the US and Germany, but also between US and North America and Europe in general. And so we responded to this call for, under the title Mandate of the Arts, and the point of departure of our project proposal was this ambivalent but fascinating notion by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who's considered to be one of the most important thinkers of European Enlightenment. So next year is Kant's 300-year anniversary, and the concept that Kant gives us is from his work, Kritik der Urteilskraft, Critique of Aesthetic Judgment. And I'll first say it in German because it sounds very nice in German. He says, das Schöne ist Zweckmäßigkeit ohne Zweck. So he says, the beautiful is purposiveness without purpose. And so the point of departure for us was this notion of non-purposiveness. And this idea is also taken up by another very important Jewish German philosopher, Theodor Adorno. So Adorno wrote this work on aesthetic theory, and the first line of aesthetic theory is about the right of art to exist. He talks about the existence, Recht der Kunst. And he says, why does art even have a right to exist? And here he draws back on the Kantian idea of non-purposiveness, and I'm making a very crude summary, but Adorno makes a distinction between good art and bad art. And the example that Adorno gives us of bad art is Bertolt Brecht. And I, as a young student who was very excited by Brecht, when I first read Adorno, was very provoked. And Adorno argues that even if art is in the service of emancipatory political goals, it's still bad art because it becomes instrumentalized. Yeah, it becomes merely an instrument towards these higher goals. And his example of good art, in contrast to Brecht, is Beckett. And why is Beckettian art good art? Because it cannot be instrumentalized. Yeah? And this got us thinking, of course, these were questions we were already struggling with, but while preparing our project proposal, what we did was, and what we are trying to do is juxtapose this idea of non-purposiveness with another very important concept that we particularly as post-colonial queer feminist scholars find interesting is the idea of artivism. And that's the relationship between art and activism, of course, as the notion tells us, but it's a larger question of the relationship between politics, ethics, and aesthetics. Now there are a lot of scholars who have, just dismissed Adorno by saying he was an elitist, or he was just, another philosopher who was just doing ivory tower armchair philosophizing, which has nothing to do, he didn't want to dirty his hands with the real world. And yet we have to bear in mind that Adorno, of course, was talking about aesthetic practices in the context of fascism and capitalism. So his critique comes from this understanding of how aesthetic practices played a very important role during Nazi fascist propaganda. So there's another very provocative saying by Adorno where he says, Lieber kein Kunst als sozialistischer Realismus. So rather no art than socialist realism. And here Adorno is saying that even when aesthetic practices aspire to transform the world, like Brechtian plays, they somehow end up reinforcing the status quo when they become mere propaganda. And this is at least in our perspective, a really, really challenging, ambivalent take on the relationship between aesthetics, politics, and ethics. The last little point that I want to address before I hand over the floor to Maria is our understanding of the role of aesthetics. So on the one hand, we see aesthetics as familiarizing ourselves with the unfamiliar. Yeah, that aesthetic opens up new worlds. Whether it is to, in the context of consciousness raising, teaches us about things that we did not know, nurtures, fosters empathy for the pain of others. It kind of, takes us, and this is again a Kantian idea, from a subjective level to a universal level. Yeah, so this is Kant's idea of nurturing aesthetic judgment. It helps you escape from individuality into universal humanity. On the other hand, so this is like kind of a dialectic. On the other hand, aesthetic practices also promise or give us the opportunity of defamiliarizing the familiar. And there is the counterintuitive moment in the aesthetic, where you, in a certain way, are disoriented, in a certain way, have this moment of estrangement, and this moment of estrangement can lead to what Adorno also talks about, epiphany. Yeah, there can be moments of, aha, I had not thought of it in this manner. And another analogy while reading Adorno and Kant that I thought of was there's this wonderful theory in heterodox Indian philosophy. I've been trained in classical Indian philosophy, and that's the notion of anekantavada. So to put it simply, you must have all read of the parable of the 7 blind men and the elephant, and each of them claims to know the truth about the elephant. And then they realize that, they have a limited perspective and that actually none of them can claim to know the entirety of the truth about the elephant. And actually, anekantavada is a very, very important principle of the idea of nonviolence in classical Indian philosophy of ahimsa. And you can only practice nonviolence if you recognize not just the limitation, but also the contingency of your perspective. And this is something, possibly, that aesthetics offers us. The moment of humility, the moment of recognizing that, aha, one can see it differently. And like I said before, handing over the floor to Maria, when we started, charting out our East Coast tour. So from Georg already pointed out, we're coming from Chicago. Tomorrow we have a talk in Providence. Then we have 2 events in New York, and then the finale is in Washington, D.C. When we thought of Boston, we immediately thought of course, Tania, and then later we came across Andrea's work. And we thought that what's the fun of struggling with problems if you cannot, suck other people into your troubles. So we thought there's always safety in collectivity. Being good Marxist, socialist, I always joke I'm Nikita married to a Castro. That tells you everything about my political ideology. So we thought, let's do this collectively. And we thought these would be good comrades to share our struggles with. And so we look forward this evening to thinking together. And we don't promise, so no money-back guarantees. Very important disclaimer. We do not promise any solutions on how to save the world in 3 steps. We certainly promise to raise more questions than give answers. And yet we hope that this will be a meaningful and fruitful evening for all of you all. So thank you very much for turning up on this glorious fall day. It's very flattering. We know that there are always parallel events happening. So it's very, very flattering that people turn up to listen to us, and we really look forward to the discussion. But first, let me hand over the floor to Maria, and then we look forward to Tania and Andrea's interventions.
Let me start also by thanking the Goethe-Institut here in Boston for this invitation. We are very honored and very happy to be here. I have been in Boston once, but I was very young at that time. So it is, and one sees also, like growing older, that the perspectives even on a city changes. You see other things that you don't see when you're very young. So, and Nikita already gave you all a kind of an idea what our project is about and what are the questions that we are struggling with. And let me just give like just 2 footnotes to what Nikita already said, because she ended on the note on what art is all capable to do. And there is a wonderful quote by Susan Sontag who said, "Real art makes us nervous." And I like this, this thing of being, nervous and somehow uncomfortable also with yourself and with your perspectives and with your being, with your subjectivity and all. Having said that, since many, many years, there are a lot of critique on art, the art business, the art institutions, the art education. So we have to take this very seriously. We know that museums are hegemonic institutions, which are also, people would say, also terrible institutions. There's also a very nice essay written by an author whose name I now don't remember, but it says, "Why museums make me sad." And he says that they make me sad because somehow it's a representation of the representation of the representation. So somehow, like you are like in this spiral and nothing really inspiring, interesting happens. But for us, it is very interesting. By the way, we're just coming from Chicago, and the director of the Goethe-Institut in Chicago, Leonard Emmerling, just wrote a book where he talks about the powerlessness of art. So he was like actually saying, I understand that you're still hoping that art can bring new perspectives into life and that art can maybe also make you aware of, or make you even nervous. But I more and more think that art doesn't have this power anymore. So, and I think in a time of multiple crises, or a polycrisis, there are different words also even of what we are like experiencing now, it's very important to see and also to hear and to discuss with colleagues if they think that art still has a power, if art can intervene into the violence of the art institutions. What are the dynamics between reality and representation? How do we deal with even growing poverty in the cities, for example? And then, being confronted with poverty and with this very rich institutions, which are the museums. How can we make art more accessible? And as we are feminists, we of course had a look also, a genealogical look at feminist art and also feminist artivism, starting from the 70s, Judith Chicago, Miriam Shapiro, but also in Los Angeles, very famously Chicana artists, and who brought the art into the streets, you know, making murals to say we have to go out of the museums and so on. So there are a lot of very good interventions which were already made, and we would like to see in present day, in also maybe if we also reflect on what happened in the documenta, what is the role of art still? And what is, you know, the dynamic between, for example, documentary films is closer to reality, maybe, maybe not, and artivism, something that I think Tania stands for, you know, she's for me is like a kind of an icon of artivism. Yeah, and I will end with this note, and I'm really, really looking forward to this exciting dialogue and maybe also discussion. Maybe we disagree, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much.
I want to address some of the questions that Maria, well, both of you raised. I feel that the challenge of art in a way in this era is not so much the power it has to move people or to generate some sort of reaction that will bring people to do certain actions, but it is about how to be remembered and how much time art has today to be effective. Because for many years you went to museums or you read a book or a history book and so on, and you didn't have many things to entertain you or to take you out of your thoughts, like today with social media or the speed of artificial intelligence and so on. So I feel that it's not so much if art is or not capable, but it's more about how can we prepare a new set around art that allow us to understand it, to you know, digest this kind of process that, as Susan Sontag say, is something that can give us very uneven feelings that are not so easy to digest. So I think it is about the will. It is about what is the conditions to see the art, because I feel that now, in a way, the contemporary art is competing with Instagram, or it is being made to feel very quickly. I'm not saying every artist, I'm saying it almost feels like that's the demand from institutions to be nicely photographed for the social media and so on, instead of being a moment of reset, you know. I also want to say that not all the museums are the same. Not all the museums are evil. Not all the people. I think, and I'm coming from a person that do institutional critique, and I am very into trying to disrupt a little bit institutions or make them reflect on themselves. But in a way, I think there are two kinds of institutions. One, some institutions that are attached to the legacy, meaning the history of the institution itself, and other institutions that are attached to the people who are in the institution. So I think that already changes a little bit the behavior of the institution, because when you are attached to legacy, let's say the Met, for example, or the Louvre, or you know, all these big museums, MoMA, for example, to say, or Guggenheim. So these museums are attached to the legacy, meaning they don't want to disrupt what people think is their identity and what people think is their you know, the duty, you know. And there are other institutions that are either because they are younger or because they don't have a lot of money, or because they have a crazy director who wants to do crazy stuff and be critical of the institution itself, where you are allowed to do work that is actually not a celebration of the institution, but actually a blank slate to ask questions. So I think we need to make this distinction. Very quickly, talking about art and activism, I feel that for me, there was another element that I feel continue what Maria was saying, and all the elements that are in art, etc. I think there is another element for the aha, as it is now academically called, the aha moment. I think where I feel that art and activism, when it is a practice that is done together, has another element by which to be judged and evaluated aesthetically, and it's ethics. And by ethics, I don't mean to act properly or to be nice or, you know, or morally correct, but I mean ethics as a very clear set of behavior that are or not should or not be activated with the work, and actually hopefully bring a new idea about what the world is and how to behave in the world differently. So I feel that that is quite important, because it's not only about saying what everybody knows, but it's about saying what everybody is afraid to say. So I think this idea of courage, in a way that a lot of people talk about, should be seen as an aesthetic quality, not only as the person being brave, but as the work being brave. Because sometimes we are super afraid or we are mad, but the work has to be with courage. So I think also there is a difference between this idea of art that is political and art that works politically, meaning arts that generate some sort of reaction or to generate some sort of situation that is political in itself. So the work might not look political, but the consequences of it is. So I'm going to start putting images so you don't get bored. So for example, I'm going to talk about one work in two different reiterations. The work is called Where Your Ideas Become Civic Actions, which was basically 100 hours of the reading of the origin of totalitarianism in Cuba. So basically, you will see another element that I think is very important when we do political art, which is not only what we do, but be aware of what are the conditions in which the work is going to happen. So the precedent for the piece was, in the next slide, we will see a project I did before of the performance, which was a call I made to meet in the Revolution Square with a microphone to say whatever you think should be Cuba. What is your idea of a nation as a concept, but also as a Cuban in the future? So basically, in the next image, this is what happened. Like a group of people came. Of course, one thing that we always battle as an artist is like, you see how many few people came to my performance, and this is actually one of the Fidel Castro's meeting in the high popularity of the revolution, and when also they were obliging us to go to these meetings, but you can see it cannot be comparable. So already we have some, as the title of this conference say, disenchantment, because the effect will not be in millions. In the next image, we'll see also the idea of the immensity of a space as a metaphor for the immensity of what cannot be achieved, you know? So yes, all these people came, which was amazing for that performance, especially because the performance was censored. And in this case, there were different groups, journalists, dissidents, artists, and the biggest group was the secret police dressed as audience. And then in the next one, we'll see the reaction of the government was unfortunately the same reaction they always have, which is imprisoned people. There were 87 people in prison because of that performance. People who didn't even know I existed, because until then I was an artist doing political work, but in the realm of art. So I wasn't trespassing. Like in Cuba, it was this line that an artist never trespass the line and never work with activists, because then it's bad art. So the other one, after that, you see that's the reaction they had. Next. Another example, the interrogation sessions. I was saying, because I said, at one point they put me back in prison again, and I said I will not go out until you liberate the audience of the performance. And it was very interesting, because all my interrogation sessions I was talking as if the person was an art critic or somebody who understands art, and they were talking to me as they were talking to a dissident. So it was interesting this. So in one of the sessions, this interrogator told me, oh, but because the piece was called Tattling Whisper, I said, oh, but Tattling was a revolutionary. And then she literally remembered by heart the Wikipedia description of Tattling. And I said, wow, this is a great opportunity. Maybe I can use the interrogation sessions to actually do some artwork. So then I decided to do my next artwork to be for the next interrogation session. And it was the reading of the Hannah Arendt book. Why? Because I was thinking that if I read that book, at least they have to read minimum a paragraph. So they will have to discuss this in the next interrogation session, the next image, please. And then, of course, the reaction. And I was very pleased of that, because the first piece reaction was repression. In this case, the reaction was to silence the performance, because we had speakers, and they actually decide to break the street in front of my house, so nobody could hear what we said. Then, of course, what happened is that I realized that only one time event, even if it's 100 hours, is not enough to change policies, to change thinking. So I decide, next please, to actually create an institute with the name Hannah Arendt, as a way for them to understand that I understood that a performance can be silenced, but if you work with the community, if you create more people engaging in the same conversation, it will be harder for them. We can see a few images, please. So these are all the events we did. Another one is some of the people who participate in most of the events. Another. And of course, it was growing. This image for me is important, because one of the biggest challenge in Cuba and to do art in Cuba is nobody trusts you. Nobody trusts you. And we did a t-shirt saying we can trust each other, even if we knew it was not true yet. But it was just a statement of desire, and we were working on that. And the next image is actually another thing that I think political art can do, which is prefigure the future. So in this case, this is 2018, and we did a party for New Year's Eve, and we decided we were celebrating 2028 instead, because we wanted to be in the future. So the next reiteration of that, I'm in Documenta, and I needed to show what the Insta was. So the original idea is to redo the reading, and then the whole conflict started in Documenta, and I decided, you can put the next one, please. I decided to change the reading. Instead of totalitarianism was Eichmann in Jerusalem, and actually it was a piece where you were giving at the entrance one page of the book. You were said to be in the space and read for yourself, doesn't matter if aloud or to yourself. But when you enter, you had these people, like they did in the performance. I did breaking the floor. So I took what the government did to me as a piece. So for me, the important part of this piece is not exactly what happens there, but it's the fact that when you think you're done, you exit through the exit door, and then you are entering another room same size, with another guy or girl, same size, breaking the floor. And that happens 3 times. And for me, that was a metaphor of how we repeat history all the time, how we don't want to engage in it. And then just to finish, I feel that in a way, this kind of project have a time, first of all, needs to be needed to exist. So it's not something you do because you like to do it, it's just because you feel that there is a need for the work to exist, to communicate things that otherwise are not told or said or discussed at the time. But also the time it takes for the people to understand the piece, meaning the time it pushes when you realize this is art, for me is the most important part, because it's a time in which politics and political energies can be actually developed and put in action. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such an honor to be with these brilliant thinkers. And when I first got the invitation to be on this panel, I emailed Annette right away and was like, "Are you sure? Like, I am a right fit for this?" And the reason is not because I don't think the work that I do is good or not worth of being here, but I think the way in which I think my background and my work, and I'll obviously tell you more about it, addresses some of these questions very differently, but addresses them nonetheless. But I do think, and I'm very grateful to be here, because I do think it's quite important that we engage around these questions from different perspectives and different disciplines. And I hope that this will be a productive conversation. So I wanted, before I show you a few projects that I will be referencing, I'll tell you a little bit about where I come from and kind of the kind of work that I do. I'm a video journalist and documentary filmmaker, and the way I like to think about my work is it's kind of at the intersection of news and documentary. So if you think about it as a Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap between the two, but there's also a lot of area that is not overlapping, and I happen to kind of navigate this in between very kind of messy area. And even though I think those categories, even video journalism and documentary, can actually also be quite fluid and messy, they are helpful, I think, in thinking about some of these questions. And I'll give you a couple of examples, because they do also view things quite differently. And Nikita, when you were talking about the elephant, I was thinking how journalists like to think that we know the entire elephant in many ways, and often don't stop to think that we don't actually, right? But so to give you a few examples of ways in which some of these questions are addressed differently, like I think the way in which journalists look at fact checking, for instance, is very, very different than documentarians do, or the ways in which we're talking about people that we document is quite different nowadays. They're certainly not across the field, but there are many more conversations in the documentary field, for instance, around questions of how we represent people, how we call the participants in our films. The word subject has been very much ditched by many people. There are conversations about whether we should pay the people that we're documenting. And those conversations are look very differently in the journalism world. But I happen to be in the middle of the two, which obviously raises a lot of questions and tensions. And that kind of in-between space, some people have called that cinematic journalism, which sometimes is a helpful term to think about it, because I think it also raises some of the questions around aesthetics, right? And the aesthetic choices that we make when we tell the stories that we tell, and how we do it. But we also operate within the structure of journalism. So there are things that in my job I have to do, right? I have the liberty to do certain aesthetic choices, but I also have to fact check. I also have to there's certain things that I need to. So I think I operate in very different parameters than Tania, for instance, you do, right? Like there are certain things that I do in my work, but I am certainly preoccupied and interested in some of these questions. And before I show you a few of my projects that I want to reference, some of the things that I am really interested in are the ethics of representation, particularly how we work and tell the stories of people who come from marginalized communities. A lot of my work has been around immigration and sexual violence, and many times those overlap as well. I think a lot, and again, I think because the fields have evolved in many ways and are thinking about these questions, is how can we reimagine or tell stories or document stories within fields that are heavily invested, much like some of the art institutions, in some notions that are very problematic, right? And of objectivity, of, again, thinking that we know the entire elephant and not acknowledging that maybe we're just standing at the front and not, not being able to see the back of it. And so how can we tell stories in ways that reimagine those fields and question those fields and push them, but still operating within them, right? Because that's where I happen to be. And then the other, I think, important question that's obviously very, very relevant today is how do we work also in the context of a world where misinformation and disinformation are everywhere and have tangible consequences, right? And so those are things that I think a lot about in my work. And so I will show you first a short, brief segment of a documentary I directed last year. This particular fragment will talk a little bit about PTSD from the point of view of a woman who survived an assault in the U.S. Army. So it touches upon a couple of heavy things, just so you know. But the reason I can talk a little bit more about it. So this is the story of a woman who, as many of you who were here in 2020 in the US know, the question of military sexual violence was a huge issue across the country. Obviously, this has been an issue for decades. It just hasn't been in the news or in our media as much. There was a documentary maybe 12 years ago called, maybe you know it, The Invisible War, that touched upon this issue, but it, and it was quite, it caused a lot of rage, I think, among the public, but then nothing truly happened. And then 10 years later, there was a very public case. A soldier named Vanessa Guillen was murdered at the Fort Hood military base in Texas after she had reported sexual assault to her family and friends. And the person that my film follows and with whom I worked closely, Karina, when Vanessa was still missing, she created the hashtag I'm Vanessa Guillen and posted her case on Facebook, and that created, just made thousands of people to kind of share their own stories as well, and kind of triggered this national movement that really kind of accelerated, I think all of those stories. It was 2020. It put a lot of pressure on Congress and the military, and some change, like the most changes that have happened within, that address military sexual violence happened within 6 months that hadn't happened in decades. And anyway, so I'll show you that first, and then we can talk a little bit about it.
When I think about my trauma, I don't think about the guy who sexually assaulted me. Ultimately, my PTSD, it didn't come from the sexual assault itself. It came from the fact that the system failed me. It came from the leadership that was supposed to protect me and help me. Instead, they treated me like I was the problem. It made me spiral down really, really fast. I had a lot of breakdowns. I had a lot of crying, panic attacks, avoidance, imposter syndrome, sleepless night, or sleeping too much, nightmares that I had, paranoia, the feeling of suffocating and drowning every single day. I went the whole time at Fort Hood without the proper care for PTSD. PTSD definitely fractured me into different versions of myself. And the person I really dislike is person number 2, is the person that went through that trauma. And then the third one is this version of myself that I'm healing. When I'm in my actual physical body, I'm in person number 4, but it's very difficult to get there. Healing for me would be combining all 4 of those people into one, and not only just having them there, but also loving them. That's what PTSD is. It's messy, it's painful, it's one moment feeling like you can take on the world, then the next feeling like you just want to run home and curl into your bed, into your only safe spot.
I wanted to show you that piece because it was a good example of how it was. I grappled a lot with questions of how to document and convey the mental health impact of military sexual violence, which was what became one of the main issues in this story. And then in the end, we decided that the best way to do so was through animation, to try to kind of capture. These are all handmade paintings that are animated. So there are hundreds of paintings that some incredible artists in Colombia did. But ways in which, I was able to use, in collaboration with Karina, though I became quite close to her, and we had a lot of very difficult conversations around process, how to tell her story, what that meant. And it was probably the most rewarding and challenging project I've ever done, because she pushed back a lot on me, and that was really interesting. And she had had terrible experiences before with media and people who wanted to tell her story and whatnot. And this was what I was hoping, like a more collaborative process, which in some ways I think probably a journalist would not have done 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? So things are changing a little bit, I think, as well, in the ways we try to tell stories.
Nosotros fuimos la carnada para llegar al pez grande.
Was the largest workplace immigration raid in a single state in U.S.
What we learned from the raid was how divided of a country we are.
Estos mismos que fueron perseguidos ahora son considerados trabajadores esenciales.
Soy un trabajador esencial para este país, que me provean higiene en el área donde uno trabaja.
Es una resistencia de dignidad.
So this is a really, really short fragment of a really large project we did at Univision, where I was a couple of years ago, about large worksite immigration raids that became a policy during, they had happened before during the Obama years. To stop the deportation model during the Obama years was different. He deported millions of people, but kind of on a one-to-one basis. This kind of, the immigration raid became a spectacle of fear and politics during the Trump era, and had a huge impact across the country. And we were documenting those stories across the country. And the reason I wanted to show you this as well as part of this conversation is because I think I was working at Univision News Digital, which is a Spanish-speaking outlet. And I think what was really wonderful about that newsroom is that it was not afraid of, just had a clear point of view. I think it was very much serving the Latino community. I think probably some of these pieces might had never run at an Anglo or a more, your New York Times or Washington Post, whatever you call it. And so it was just really interesting to be in this newsroom and in this environment during the Trump years around questions of, again, like, how do you tell these stories when there's clearly this really messed up politics happening, right? And I think some newsroom were kind of asking, like, really grappling with these questions, and we're not being able to, I think, successfully tell some of these stories from the ground up, and really truly capturing some of these testimonies. And some of the work I think that we did there, which I'm really proud of, is that we truly focused on people who were really directly impacted by some of this, by these policies. And I think in general, in my work, how I approach it, and how in this world that I was telling you about of kind of cinematic journalism, we tend to gravitate to our very personal stories. And I think, Nikita, you were talking about that as well in terms of aesthetics, like kind of how the individual can or has the potential, or maybe not, right, of telling you a larger story. So yeah, I think that's it for me, and I'm excited and looking forward to chatting with all of you.
Thank you so much, Tania and Andrea. And this so much I could talk on to, but I'll limit myself to two questions or just points. They're not even questions, just thoughts. So when Tania was talking about, um, the role of aesthetic practices, the role of art, and the role of artists as transgressive, as disruptive, as somehow there's a wonderful German word, Trägerschicht, the bearer of critical practice. I had to immediately think about also artist and also as a revolutionary, as a hero, I had to think about this phenomenon of art washing. So what's happening increasingly is that institutions are under pressure to be critical and self-critical. And I had to immediately think about the Humboldt Forum in Berlin and the whole controversy around the Humboldt Forum. And somebody had a really brilliant idea to invite Adichie to give the welcome remarks at the inauguration of the Humboldt Forum. And I thought that was such a fantastic example of art washing, because now that the cameras are running, and this is hearsay, I cannot tell you what I've heard, the amount of money Adichie was paid to give that 20-minute talk. And I thought this was a very good example of how institutions use aesthetic practices, critical aesthetic practices, critical aesthetic practitioners to, in a certain way, immunize themselves from critique and also atone for their sins. I'm sorry, I'm using Catholic language. And it's a very smart strategy. It's a very important tactics that are being increasingly. We were at many museums where they have now this very interesting practice of reframing. So they have problematic works of art, and it's a great strategy. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but just wanted to put it out there and once again return to this dilemmatic relationship between autonomous and committed art, and the blurred lines between art, aesthetics, politics, and ethics. So art washing was one notion that I thought of. And Andrea, when we had the preparatory conversation, I gave you the example of the South African photographer, because there's very, very difficult relationship between reality and representation. So those of you all who might not be familiar with this image taken by Kevin Carter, the South African photographer, this was in the 90s, where there was this horrible famine in Sudan, and this little kid was crawling towards the feeding center, and a vulture landed close to the kid. And Kevin Carter took this image, this photograph, and won the Pulitzer Prize. And the New York Times got thousands of calls asking for, what happened to the child. Until 4 years later, we didn't know whether the child survived or not, but Kevin Carter committed suicide 6 months later, saying he could not go on doing what he was doing. Now, there was a whole controversy around whether he really committed suicide because of his work, which is also at the, what do you say, boundaries of art and photojournalism. But there was one particular aspect in the controversy which was very interesting, where they said that it was very manipulative, because the angle from which he took the photograph, one had the impression that the vulture was very close to attacking the child, but actually the vulture was very far away. And that some argued that, okay, even if it was manipulative, it played a very important role in consciousness raising, because thousands and millions of people reacted to the famine that was happening in Sudan. Till then, people were unaware of, but this particular image caught the imagination of people. And there was a lot of willingness to donate to the famine. So this question of, in German, we have two words for representation. It's not just Darstellung, but also Vertretung. So you're not just speaking about in the sense of portray, but you're literally speaking for. And so this complex relationship between representation and ethics, and the challenge, of course, how do you represent violence without reproducing violence? And you kind of shared with us the strategy, but of course, it's like, again, the Beckettian, you try, but you fail. And then you, of course, have to try again and fail better. So just like I said, there are not concrete questions, but associations that came up, the notion of art washing, and then the idea of manipulation. Because of course, for a documentary films which claim to be neutral and objective, there's no question of manipulation, because their self-understanding is, we are just showing you reality as it is. But the moment you question the contingency of the or the perspectivism of the angle of the camera, and you're self-critical, then the whole politics of representation becomes more complicated when you think the ethical aspect of it. Maria, I don't know if you have something to add on to, or we wait for the next round. Okay. Tania, would you like to go first?
Yeah. Okay. No, I think it's interesting because when I was talking before about institution, I didn't talk about this, but this is completely true. I think there is art washing in two ways. I think there are governments that use art to clean their image, because of course, if they like art, if they support art, how can they be these horrible repressive regimes? Because art is supposed to be governments who go into artists because everything else is solved, because they are so sensitive, humanistic, and so on. So I think it's interesting how governments also use art to wash their face and to look like civilized. But also there are institutions, and this is also very ironic, but there are institutions that never wanted to be criticized. Then to criticize institution became even a genre of art practice. So they have to have it in their spaces because it's like painting, sculpture, performance, now institutional critique. But the thing that is quite insane is that sometimes they invite artists who are really, really critical. But as soon as they invite them, and I'm quoting from my own life here, they say, "We love your work, but please don't do this here, don't do this here." And then they start telling you a list of things you cannot do for their institutions. Or they're super nice mamas, nice papas, who are so gentle with you and so loving and caring with you, artists in need for affection. And then they got this very soft way, and they actually manipulate everything at a moment that when you go and look back at the work you have done, you don't even recognize yourself, because it's like, this is problematic, because it's never because they don't want to be criticized. It's always because they're going to, I don't know, the director is going to be in trouble, they're going to fire the director, or think about the workers in your project that are going to be affected. And I had one occasion where I did an art piece where the person was really mad, in charge was really, really, really mad, and say, "Look what you have done. Now our project can never happen again. This is a project done by a huge American institution with a lot of money. It's not going to stop because I did the performance." And I said to that person, "Your job is to find the ways in which this can continue. My job is to find ways in which to say the truth about what is happening." So it is interesting because sometimes you even feel that you are a name on a wall and not an opportunity for real critique. So I think that's quite difficult. I don't know if that was a question for me. It was another question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually want to speak to that question as well, because when you were talking about that, it reminded me as well of, again, I think in the summer of 2020, there was so much criticism of the media, journalists, documentary filmmakers, right? Like any kind of representational practice. And immediately newsrooms across the country, at least in the US, I don't know what the state was in other countries, where hiring right and left, like people who had historically not been part of those newsrooms, right? So it's almost like, I mean, it happened quickly, checks, but then the actual, once a lot of those people got into newsrooms, the institutions were not changing. We're actually not that interested in some of those, you know, significant changes. And then I think the flip side of that as well is that many people got, you know, as a Latina, I happen to have worked in immigration stories for many years, but it doesn't mean that's all I can do or want to do, right? And I think that's the flip side of that as well, is that a lot of people got stuck into those kind of roles that because they were part of a certain community, they had to document and speak for and represent that community, right? So that's something that I thought about as well. You know, when you were talking about kind of this, the ways in which institutions have reacted and to changes, sometimes just, you know, cosmetic changes, they approach it in the way. And then I think your question of representation and manipulation, I think I don't think this is across the field, but I will say that I do think that there are more and more conversations happening around. I don't think the young, like, I think that even the word objectivity is no longer used among some of the emerging journalists, right? It's not even something that's considered very, very criticized, but it's not true across the board. I was talking to a colleague the other day who works at a photo agency where the views are much more rigid, and exactly to your point about the photo, right? And the photographer, there's a way in which some of these institutions have historically considered themselves that they can be the providers of truth, and this photo is as it is, right? And then I think in the video world, this has been really, I think the documentary world, and again, like this distinction is helpful. They have been asking over the last few years, I think, more bold questions, and I think are more have been really interested in kind of challenging those. And I think there are more and more right now. There are a lot of filmmakers creating hybrid documentaries where they also incorporate fiction to tell truths about the world, and that's, I think, really interesting and exciting. And I also think that I think another point I want to make about how people consume these things is quite important. And on one side, I think with the rise of things like TikTok and Instagram, where people have become, and you know, with our phones, just filming all the time, and I think people have, there's like a better, wider understanding of how a film is edited, right? Like that the fact that a shot goes one after the other is not exactly how it happened in real life, right? There was a decision made, there was a cut made, and there's, I think, a larger understanding of that. But at the same point, with the technologies and the ability of everyone to post anything online, and you know, somebody say, I just made a documentary about whatever topic it is, right? There are also a lot of questions and confusion around, you know, we know that a lot of misinformation has been circulating precisely because of that access, right? So yeah, again, don't know if it answered any of your question, but speak to them in some way.
No, I just remember hearing you, Andrea, that also in the art world, at least, which is where I am, my life happens, is there is this new exotization of the other, being camouflaged by acceptance. And I think this is important because the institutions are also not only with people who are activists, but also trying to be like, okay, we cannot ignore these people anymore. We have to have them. But are they really changing the institution for these people with other proposals that are also political, not only aesthetic, who come from other worlds, who have been repressed, who have been obliviated, who have been taken out of their history? Are they really changing the institution for these people to be in the place in their own ecosystem, instead of fixing the work to enter a museum, fixing the work to be consumed in an exhibition, instead of doing all the things that are natural for the practice? And I think in that sense, in a way, that's what the museums, the institution in general, whether it is a newspaper or it is a museum, have to not to present, these stories or to present these art practices from other quote-to-quote people, but to change their internal system in order for the stories or the artworks to be seen from the perspective where those people are in power, not just showing at somebody else's house. I don't know if and in that sense, I feel Documenta 15 was not, it was a lost opportunity for a lot of things because people focus on other discussions. But I think that's one of the reasons I felt Documenta 15 was interesting, because they had to adapt to what everybody brought in the exhibition, whether it's space or cultural or so on, but whatever, that's another conversation. But it's just that it's not about criticizing the institution, it's about them changing their infrastructure and the way in which they behave.
I think it's a really, really important point, because change is also one of the words that we struggle with. What is change and how can change happen? How can really change happen? And what we see right now, I think, after a very, very long time of institutional critique, is that the institution somehow adapted to the strategy of critique and is not criticizable anymore, because they're very flexible immediately, adapt to the critique, and then the reframe, they change some faces and so on, but the institution remains the institution. So I think this is very important. Another thing that I wanted also to address is something, I think, Tania, you said it also in our pre-discussion or pre-meeting, that you are working also on utopias. Because when I hear actually hearing both of you, I was thinking also of the idea of utopia. And I worked a lot on Ernst Bloch. And for him, actually, utopia is not something, it's not a place somewhere, but it's more like the work that you have to do to achieve change. So how do you get into transformation? And that is very important, because for him, you have to go through history. So you need memory work. That Jacques Derrida would say deconstruction is actually memory work, nothing else. It's just memory work. So you have to go to do this political work, to go through history. And you have to analyze the present, the here and yet. So you can't escape only into memory, you only do memory work in forgetting the here and yet. And then you have to be capable of seeing and somehow proposing, having also the courage to propose a better world. You have to have also this hope that there might be a possibility for a better hope. And there is this wonderful saying is like hope against hope. And I think the one hope is like, it's like keeping criticizing and the institutions adapting to the critique. And then there is another hope that stands against this hope. And for that, I really found it very interesting, the idea of ethics that Gayatri Spivak once proposed. She said, ethics actually a moment. It's the moment. And then that's when it happens, this moment, you do the right thing or you do the wrong thing. And for that, the mind has to be trained. And I really believe that, still believe that art can train you to, when the moment arises, to do the right thing and to be ethical. So that somehow resonated also in Tania when you said it's not about art being political and doing something political, but somehow making people do the right thing, or being political or being courageous, somehow. And that is also comes for me also with, it's a very problematic word, but anyway, good documentary work, something that is not just, putting the camera there and not thinking also about what is the consequence for the one who is portrayed here, because this is also can also be very violent here. So yeah, that would be my.
Wow, you touched a very tough point. So I feel I always I say to friends sometimes that utopia for me is the politically correct or socialist word or political studies, sociology, whatever way to say faith, which is something that belongs to another era, you know. And I feel it's related to faith. You say hope, but I think it's faith because also hope, but more than anything, faith because you know you're doing something that you might not see the result for. So instead of being, you don't know God is there because you don't see it, but you know He's there. In this case, it's more about you know you're doing the political work, but you will not see it, and you will not benefit from it. You will not live in this amazing thing you work for. So I think utopia is very important word. I use it a lot because it's the understand for me. It's the understanding that is utopia has to be done in the moment as well as ethic, as you said, but also is something that you create for others. In a way, it's not for yourself. And there was at some point a phrase used a lot, said realizable utopias. Seeing utopia and also coming from Cuba and so on, like utopia was never this impossible place. It was actually the way you create a path, you know, so there's never a place to go. It's always the path you create. So I like this idea of realizable utopia, not as shrinking utopia or think smaller, but as understanding that these are things that can really happen, because a lot of time people thought that utopia is the impossible, and it's not true. I mean, it's not the way I see it. But in terms of ethics, I love what you said. I really think art is bearing a lot of responsibility here, saying that will prepare people from that. I also feel that ethic is not so easy, you know, because how is to know what is the right thing, you know, and I have worked about this a lot because it is very easy to know what the right thing is after the time pass and everybody agree, or everybody has enough information to see what was really happening. And many times when the person do the right thing is seen as the wrong thing. So right and wrong is not as easy. And I feel in that sense that what I have to rely is on the sense of justice and also understanding what you feel, understanding your reaction to things, because that's what is the truth for you. That's what is really correct or not for you, you know. So yeah, I don't think it's so easy. Right now, I'm criticizing the Cuban government. For many people, that's not correct, you know. But I'm the one who, my body, you know, endure things. I have my friends in prison for doing nothing, you know. So I think ethics should be seen as a personal process where you understand where your idea of justice is. Yeah, and it might differ from other people. Yeah.
There's very hard questions. So I have no answers for you, but I do think that I think around the question of change, I think it's something that Tania already referenced, and I think journalists in general, right? Like when you go into the field, documentary journalism, you kind of dream that you'll change something, right? Like that's kind of the ultimate goal. And I think more often than not, you don't, right? There's no tangible necessarily change. So I can't tell you that this film did anything, but I do know that it was part of, you know, during that summer of 2020, there was a truly like a national collective awareness around this issue, and changes happen, right? And this was part of it. So it's impossible to quantify. But I will say that both to your question of change and your comment on ethics, I think this process in particular, like working with Karina, right? was like extremely eye-opening to me, particularly around questions of ethics. And I think it became very clear to me that these processes have to be collaborative and have to be done together. And out of that film and all the lessons I learned, what's interesting is that there are a lot of lessons, but it's not. I can't create a step-to-step like instructions, right, to tell someone if you do a story about. But I think in some ways there's like this very kind of intimate process that she and I had. It's revolutionary and radical in its small tiny way, and I think even creating, we actually have talked a lot about both of us creating some kind of tool. It's not like a set of instructions or a prescriptive tool, but more of like what was the process like? Because obviously as well, when you see a lot of these films or these projects, they're so messy actually in what goes on behind the scenes. Is not a clear-cut process. It's always involves emotions. You often hurt people who are who are being portrayed. There's a really wonderful film that just came out last year called Subject. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a documentary about documentary subjects. So they look at 5 different films and what has happened to them, what was the process like. And sometimes they had both things. They felt that it was a terrible experience, but something in their lives improved, right? So it was both an extractive process and also a cathartic process or a beneficial process in some way. So, this I think these processes are so messy, but in some ways embracing the messiness might be what you're talking about, is like what you learn, what prepares you for the ethical decisions. And I think being able to, in my case, be transparent with the people I work with and document, it's a big part of that. And again, I don't know, I do hope and that there is more awareness, and I think willingness in both fields to have these questions, out on the table, right? And yeah.
Thank you so much. I think this is a very good time to invite the audience members to put forth their questions, their thoughts. They don't necessarily have to be, formulated questions. You can also just share with us spontaneously, perhaps some of the concerns you have in your work. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was really, really inspiring in so many
Just
ways.
one very quickly.
Yes.
Tania, can you hear the person? Okay, great. So I don't have to summarize then the question. Okay, great. Go ahead, please.
I just thought that it might be helpful to go back to the beginning. And since, you're both coming from the German context and you started out with the German context, and I thought it's interesting that we started talking about beauty and we ended up with justice and truth. And I wonder whether this is something that, in other words, what would Kant and Adorno say?
Yeah, so I'm very happy to answer this question, because there was another very important point that was raised by Maria, and we haven't addressed it yet, and that is the issue of art education. And here I'll move from Kant to Schiller. And Schiller wrote this very, very important essay on the aesthetic education. And Schiller actually takes up a very important point where he says that before people can become political subjects, they have to become ethical subjects. And before they can become ethical, in order to become ethical subjects, their aesthetic judgment has to be fostered and nurtured. There's another very important word that I somehow missed addressing when I was talking about Kant, and that's the notion of disinterestedness. So when Kant talks about the experience of the sublime, now, of course, there's a lot of elitist aspects to it. So Bourdieu wrote an entire book on critiquing Kant's class bias and saying, this is just the bourgeoisie rebelling against the aristocracy, because the aristocracy monopolized the experience of the aesthetics. And what Kant is doing is taking it away from the royalty and appropriating it for the bourgeoisie. And what about the working class? Yeah, and the working class is only left with entertainment. Yeah, and what Schiller is here, a very important intervention, which also inspired post-colonial reflections on aesthetics and the role of aesthetics in the processes of decolonization, is so when we talk about the disinterested, it's not indifference. It is that it is not self-interested. That aesthetics is not just about what is in my self-interest. What can I get out of this? It's not transactional. It's not calculative. If I invest so much in the stock market, I will get 10 times more. There is a certain level of risk involved for yourself, as Tania shared, but also those around you. The material context in which aesthetics is produced. And what Schiller is trying to, and there's lots to critique because it's Eurocentric, it's androcentric and all of that. But what Schiller is trying to do is, again, allude to the promise that nurturing and fostering aesthetic judgment brings together the possibility of reconciling beauty and justice. And of course, there is the decolonial challenge where they say that, you know, what we need is an epistemic disobedience. We need to go, we need to reject the entire European canon. We don't want to read Kant and Schiller and Adorno. These are just, you know, elitist theorists. And we need to go back to pre-colonial aesthetic practices. But there, in my view, there is the danger of what Tania and also Andrea pointed out, then the non-Western world is merely reduced to being native informants. Yeah, and performing authenticity. Yeah, so Tania becomes a representative of, you know, I don't know, third world revolution, and Andrea becomes a representative of the third world subaltern, or at least not representing the third world subaltern women in the sense of, or giving them a voice, giving them a platform. And I think that's why we also found it meaningful, although we outed ourselves as queer post-colonial feminists, meaningful to engage with scholars like Kant, like Schiller, like Adorno through Spivak, and see how there is a certain opportunity here of where aesthetics, aesthetic theory can function both as pharmacon, as both poison, that which can entrench capitalist, neoliberal, colonial structures, but also as counterpoison, that which can disrupt, transgress, and transform these structures. But I promise to involve the audience members more. So that would be my immediate response. Maria, do you want to add something? Tania, Andrea? Yeah, Tania, go ahead.
May I say something? I think that the problem is that still the Western culture has an idea that either or instead of and. So every time you bring a new culture, a new knowledge, they always feel that that will erase them instead of saying, hey, this is another way of seeing it. Let's embrace all of the ways. So I think this is still a process that I feel the aesthetic judgment should be also about aesthetic respect instead of judgment. And decide that that I don't know, I always, and I told this my students the other day, I always remember the movie The Mission, where at the end Robert De Niro, who is like a priest or a missionary in Amazonia, brings the, I don't know, the bishop and everybody. It's a big deal. They put all these chairs in the middle of the Amazonas to hear this amazing kid who has an angelical voice singing Ave Maria by Schubert, instead of going there to understand the way in which these people see the world and see what they can learn from them. You know, so I think it's always this idea of more than aesthetic judgment. I feel it's a problem of putting some respect in the equation. Yeah, and also in a way, I also feel that aesthetic is more than anything how we define humanity, and this is why it has this moment of I don't know, even pleasure. You know, when you see something ethical in the aesthetic, because it's like, wow, this is a new way of seeing humanity. This is a new way of seeing who we are. You know, but yeah. Sorry, this is something very quickly. And also one thing I forgot to say before, the right and the wrong also is related to time, because sometimes you have a timing on the issues that is different than the collective timing of understanding. So sometimes the right thing, like in the Nazi Germany, it was the right thing to pretend you don't know anything, and you know, or not to involve it, you know, and then maybe 50 years later, people say, why you didn't, like people ask why you didn't do the right thing. But that was the right thing back then, you know, quote unquote. So I think right and wrong is about how you think, synchronize, put together your own personal time for things with the collective time.
There's a lot of talk about aesthetic judgment, but you've mentioned this a number of times. First of all, I have to say I found the talk very fascinating. But I have a question, because the aesthetics changes over time. I mean, so when we say now we're trying to decide something, we're trying to educate people to create aesthetic judgments. What are we looking for them to do?
Quick answer to both this question of temporality is that the idea is that the content of ethics or the content of aesthetics can change, but the capacity is what is universal. So this is what Kant would call subjective universality. That and this is what I meant by this bourgeois challenge to the aristocracy, that everybody has the capacity to experience aesthetic or sublimity. And this capacity is democratic. And that it's not just, you know, the domain that is monopolized by a certain privileged class. And that's the universal aspect of it. And then what the content of the aesthetic experience is, that of course is temporally and spatially determined. So what you might find as pleasurable or what you might experience as the sublime might not be shared by others. That possibility is there, but the very fact that you have the capacity of, I'm repeating myself now, is universal.
So to follow up with that, I'm very curious about this, because how to deal with this, because I don't know if it's the same in other countries, but in the US in the 80s, what happened was our national endowment stopped funding individual artists because they felt that the work was, and operas and things like that, because that was elitist, and there's no reason why the public should be funding things that are elitist, blah, blah, blah. And now we have almost the reverse, where we're funding the things have to be appeal to a wide public and be accessible to all, which doesn't necessarily, I'm not sure it always is necessarily beneficial. So not that the other was necessary, but I'm wondering how one might think about fixing this situation, because now we have sort of another swing another way.
I don't want to monopolize I have a response, but maybe I'll let Tania and Andrea and Maria respond first.
I want to hear your response.
It's just that I've just been struggling with these questions so much. That's why maybe I have a response. I think a good, I mean, I'm not a policymaker, I'm only a philosopher, so I don't have a quick fix solution, but I can only give you a historical example of how these kinds of debates have been addressed. So this is actually, say, for example, Adorno's critique of jazz, where he says the problem with jazz is that, first of all, it's like kind of a aesthetic practice that is attached to a certain collective, although although it can be emancipatory and can be progressive, it is nonetheless, again, an aesthetic practice that becomes an instrument. And of course, his critique of the cultural industry and jazz becomes a commodity. And so I think this is a bit of a challenge of, on the one hand, elitism, and on the other hand, and this is also a point that is taken up by Bourdieu in his critique of Kant, the other end is populism. There you say, oh, it's open to the masses, and then there the basic question of what counts as art comes to the fore. This is also what happened with the Documenta 15, where a lot of, old school art critics said, this is not art, this is Carnaval de Culturen. Yeah, this is, I don't even know how to translate that into English. This is carnival of the cultures, it's like everybody's come together, and it's again culturalization of aesthetics, and this is not transgressive aesthetic practices. And ironically, if I'm not mistaken, and again, this is being recorded, so please feel free to fact check me, but this was one of the most successful documentas, the Documenta 15, in terms of the number of people who attended the Documenta 15. And this was
That's what they say.
That's what they say.
The
but this is what
say, yeah.
precisely was a disqualifying factor for a lot of art critics who's saying, yeah, but this is not art. This is just dumbing down the audience by pandering to what they want to see. And I would say the time will tell. I think here the temporality question comes in, that in hindsight, we will be able to look back in a few years and think about, I don't think there is an easy balancing act between elitism and populism. I think that that there is a certain bias in these institutions. I'll just share a very, very personal experience. I hope you'll allow me to do this. I was in a museum with Maria's mother, working class person, and we paid a $20, 20 euro entry fees. We entered the museum, very, very intimidating space. And the first thing Maria's mother said to me was, oh my God, what must it take to keep this place clean? Working class woman, no? And I was like, I mean, there were like these art objects put on display where I was blown away. And the first thing she thought about, I think it was maybe one of the few times she'd ever been in this space. And she was excited to be in this space, but totally intimidated of how to move around in this space. And I think these are very, very difficult questions to deal with. And of course, when it's context like Germany, where they are public funded, all museums are public funded, it becomes, unlike US, where, it's a lot of private philanthropy and charity which goes into art institutions, it becomes really an ethical question. I think we are slowly, or Jörg, did you want to ask a question, or were you indicating that I do better time management?
No. I don't want to finish something which is going on, but we thought 90 minutes would be a good time. But if there's any last question, Natasha, for sure.
Thank you all so much. This has been a really amazing conversation to listen to. I think I have a lot of different questions, and I'm going to try to narrow them down into one. Mainly, I think the discussion of the way that working class people and working class artists are supposed to be able to engage with art and the art world is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And I'm wondering if any of you have a response to the question of how we can better put the tools into the hands of working class people to actually express themselves in art. I think, honestly, that story that you just told, Nikita, about Maria's mom being in a museum and not really knowing how to enter into that space and engage with the art, I think, is probably something that a lot of working class people experience, entering institutions that are sometimes not very welcoming spaces. I mean, to begin with, having to pay probably more than you make in an hour as a working class person is immediately something that's going to prevent those people from entering those spaces. So I was lucky enough to grow up somewhere where a museum in the town was free. So I was able to actually encounter art in person from a pretty young age. But I'm just thinking about people who haven't had that chance to do that, haven't ever had the chance to study a painting or study how to paint. They have really, really important stories to tell and things to express. So how can we kind of share those materials and tools and thinking with them?
I think it's a very, very important question, but a very difficult question to answer. And we are not the first ones to ask the question also and to try to find strategies. And there were, of course, strategies already, let's say, in the 19th century in England. And that was unfortunately connected to civilize the working class. So, to make them into, people who can behave and can be, also move through a space aesthetically. It's not just to, to feel comfortable, but also to, to be silent, to somehow have also this epiphanies, and it's very, very complicated. And then it was very often linked to social work, which didn't make it better. So then there was a critique on the civilizing mission, but it was still something that it was not the same to go with bourgeois people to the museum and then to discuss the art and somehow also the intertextuality between different artworks and how they work together and so on, but just to give them the opportunity. I have once, I was in a panel discussion where this question was also asked, and a person in the audience said, see, we always take the workers when they have one free day, and we all don't ask them, but bring them into the museum. And I was like, okay, I mean, please, I mean, this is not a very good strategy, because, I mean, this is not how it works, So I think one thing is still art education, and we have to think about art education, how it is done, who does it. And the other thing is, but also building collectivities, and collectivities which are not homogeneous. You have to, I mean, I always use the term, the idea of contrapuncture. So where the perspectives don't go together, they don't have to be homogeneous, they have not to be homogeneous, but on the contrary, there should be contrapuncture so that you have the possibilities to bring also your affects forward, and also to, like you said it, to push back, the people also push back and said, what is this? I don't understand this. And it's not only working class. It starts much earlier. It's really because even students in my classroom very often said, I don't understand this. What are they doing there, making noises and people are trying to read something? I don't get the point. What is the whole thing about it? And I think it is a very slow process. It's a very slow process, but I think it's very necessary. And I think what is very often happening is like to try to fix it quickly. And of course, it is always has to be embedded into a systemic question. So, I mean, you can't just somehow help the working class into understanding art, but leaving them in a situation where they hardly can survive. I mean, why should they go to a museum? To be very honest, most of them have better thing to do. They have to survive. So, and I think one point is very important, and it was, I mean, both of you have also mentioned it, it's the difference between right and justice. So people would say there's a right for the working class to go to the museum, but justice is another thing. It's a completely different thing. And there is also somehow like some, there is a lack between right and justice. So we can fight for rights, but actually we should see how art can be transformed so that it is able to create more justice, a more just system. And this is not an answer to your question, but the thoughts that are like going through my mind.
I don't.
No, go,
I don't
go.
have. Okay, I don't have an answer, but I do have a bad example of how kind of it hasn't worked in my field, which is that, of course, for so long we've never had stories told by certain communities, and over the last few years, again, there's been kind of an effort to fund from private philanthropic foundations. Obviously with cameras, equipment is expensive and accessible. So there's been an effort to get people who have been historically not on the table in those spaces to come and tell their own stories, whether it's documentary journalism. And I think what has happened, one good thing that has happened, of course, is that there are more of those stories out there, but also it has forced, or people have felt forced to share certain stories that they think they're expected to share, of trauma or of whatever, and again being boxed into a certain category and not being able to tell whatever story they want to tell. And also the funding and financial systems and the gatekeepers of the money, that it hasn't changed. And so again, like at its core, institutionally, some of this institutions in documentary in particular, I'm thinking, are still, are the same, right? And so they're just kind of perpetrating certain terrible practices. And I do think it's great that we're seeing more people doing the stories, but it's going to be a very slow process, to your point, I think, as well.
Tania, you have the last word.
That's not a good thing to have. But no, I don't want to minimize the very complex question, because these are many ways to answer that. I agree with everything you guys have said. My fear is to instrumentalize art, because all the art that I would love, it's not going to happen. I would love to ask everybody what kind of art they imagine when they hear everything we're saying, because I think there is a tendency by institution, but also by people who think they bear the truth of what kind of art is the correct art. And sometimes the correct art is the incorrect art. But so I think this is also a tension, how art can be useful and how it's not instrumentalized. But in terms of institution, I will be very synthetic, even if it's not the complete truth, what I'm going to say, or even maybe truth. But in my experience, I feel like what institutions have to do is related to money, time, and power. Money means giving this artist the same amount of money they give to the white, male, Western, or American artists. Because many times we are invited to this institution, but they give you a tenth of what they give those artists. So of course your work is going to suffer. It's not going to be as big, as ambitious. And then it's always this kind of like, oh, but this artist, this other artist work in these dimensions, this limited, it's that they give the big money to other people. So this is one way to distribute equally funds between the production of work. Also distribute money in the communities. Use part of the money of your institution to invest in the community. Why they have to go to a museum if the museum have never approached them? So I think that's also a good quick idea that I've seen in some places. So in terms of time, it is two things. Time also as a way to gain trust from the community, meaning understanding that you have to invest this time in the community is not only like, oh, we are so good. We did Cinco de Mayo with a big accent, Cinco de Mayo in the community. No, that's not being part of the community. That's not helping anybody. It's just you checking, So I think time is about commitment. It's about being present in the space where you are not welcome naturally. And you have to understand what kind of relationship you can create. It's not the same relationship in your big palace art museum. It's a different power relationship. And the other thing is that in terms of time, that we need to get out of this event-driven culture. Because many institutions think, oh, we did this month 2 events in the community. That's it. We need to start understanding that commitment in society is not an event. It's a kind of behavior that you create, institutional behavior that you have to create, that is over 5, 10, 15 years or forever, you know. So I think that's also in terms of that. And in terms of power, I mean, I think it's clear what has to be done. Just to concede power, it's impossible to have a real conversation when the institution is on its throne, inviting you to conversation. No, give me the throne, or let's share the throne, you know, or take a break from the throne. You know, I mean, the power needs to be shared. It cannot be symbolic empowerment. It has to be real empowerment. There are many, many, many other things, but I'm just resuming 3 that I thought are important.
What an intense session we had, 90, maybe 100 minutes with a lot of questions showing up. As you said, more questions than answers. Well, questions to the Goethe-Institut as well, I think, if we talk about art washing, about questions how we spend our budgets, how do we work with community. I take something with me for the next weeks and months and years for sure as well. And that's topics we have to deal with as a Goethe-Institut as well. And so I'm very grateful about raising them up. And my feeling is there's still a lot to say. And if you're still feel like discussing more after this recorded session, please stay a little bit with us. We have prepared a little glass of wine and some water in the back room. And let's continue this discussion. Thank you so much, Annette and Shaya, for making this possible. And Tania, Andrea, Nikita, and Maria for being with us. It was a great night. And